Welcome everyone to Aloft's Before You Fly, Check the Map webinar series. We are kicking off this month with the ABCs of National Airspace Types, Part 1, Controlled Airspace. We're so grateful to have Kevin Morris here from the FAA's drone guide. And so myself, I am Erica Cooley. I am Head of Community here at Aloft. I'm at Part 107. I also have been working with Aloft and our community here to share informational, educational materials all about the expanding industry of drones. And I'm also a proud member of Women in Drones and Women Who Drone. And then today we're joined, as I said, by Kevin Morris. He is a subject matter expert on UAS operations and coordinates UAS communications for the Federal Aviation Administration. Previously, he worked in the FAA's Flight Standards Service, developing regulations, policy, and programs for drones. He has a bachelor's degree in aviation and airline transport pilot certificate, remote pilot certificate, and is a certified flight instructor. He is a native Minnesotan, and Morris is passionate about embracing new technology and empowering the drone community to operate safely. So thank you so much, Kevin, for joining me today.
Well, thanks, Erica, for having me on. And you got all those certificates right. You know, pilots, we always like to make sure we list all of our certificates so everybody knows. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. You have a great amount of experience. So we're very happy to have you here to talk with us today about all the different types of controlled airspace that we see in the National Airspace System. So I'll hand it to Kevin. Here is a slide that kind of gives an overview of all the different types of airspace. So I'll let you speak to that.
Yeah, this is great. And kind of what you're seeing here on the screen is a very nice pictorial image of our airspace. And it really shows how we divide everything up here in the United States. Now, it looks a little bit complicated. There's a lot of different colors on that. There's a lot of things happening, a lot of words, but really in terms of when we're talking about drone operations, it boils down into a couple of things. Controlled airspace versus uncontrolled airspace. So as we get into our discussion today, we're going to start off by talking about uncontrolled airspace. And uncontrolled airspace is also known as Class Gulf airspace. And then we're going to get into what we call controlled airspace. And that probably has more impact on drone operators. So controlled airspace is Class Bravo, Class Charlie, Delta, and Echo 2 airspace. A little bit more on that one later. But I think what's important to remember is that prior to flying, it's really, really important that drone operators remember to check the airspace before they fly. And that can be done through the Before You Fly app, or really any of the FAA's US service supplier provider apps, to see if their planned operation is going to be in uncontrolled or controlled airspace. So if it's in controlled airspace, you're going to need an authorization from the FAA to fly prior to flying, and that's the important piece. So we call this an airspace authorization. While most airspace authorizations can be requested and granted through our low altitude authorization and notification capability, also known as LAANC, some airspace authorization requests must still go through the FAA's drone zone. So if your flight is in uncontrolled airspace, that's that Class Gulf airspace, you do not need to receive FAA authorization prior to flying in it. However, it's always important to know the rules of the airspace you're flying in. And if you're flying in Class Gulf airspace, you need to make sure you stay below 400 feet, which is the maximum altitude that you can fly there.
Yeah, we'll go to this next slide here. So this kind of starts showing you a little bit of a visual of what different airspace types look like on the Before You Fly app. Right now, this is looking at, as Kevin mentioned, Class Gulf, uncontrolled airspace. So when you're looking at the Before You Fly application, it's important to know that this is a free app that's on desktop and on mobile that allows you just to have more airspace awareness. So looking at the airspace prior, as Kevin said, to taking off, to really have that education of if you are in uncontrolled or controlled airspace. A good differentiation to mention is that Before You Fly is not a LAANC provider. It's not a USS. So you would need to either go to the Aloft application or one of the other UAS service suppliers applications to apply for a LAANC authorization when you are in controlled airspace. But we will get into that in our demo and then as we look at some of the different types of controlled airspace. So here you'll see there isn't any color shading around the airspace that we're looking. We're looking at Houston Methodist, the Woodlands Hospital area. You can see there are some notifications of different uncontrolled heliports. These are maybe heliports or seaplane bases or municipal airports, things like that, that are not in controlled airspace. So you would want to be mindful, of any air traffic, but you do not need to apply for a LAANC authorization prior to taking off here. So you'll see there's no color shaded area and you are permitted to fly up to 400 feet AGL given that the airspace is safe, and you can operate there. So that is uncontrolled airspace. And if there are any questions about that, you're welcome at any time to type into the chat or the Q&A feature. We'll be doing a live Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions throughout, feel free to chat those in to us. And then move over. We'll hand it over to Kevin to start on some of our controlled airspace.
All right, so here we go, jumping into the big time stuff here. Right off the bat, we're going to talk about Class B as in Bravo airspace. And this is airspace that typically surrounds our nation's busiest airports. So, Chicago O'Hare, Atlanta, Minneapolis International, a lot of the airports in New York, of course. So this is airspace that's very, very busy. One example here that you're looking at on your screen is in Denver, Colorado, right? Denver International Airport's another airport that's in Class Bravo airspace. That's depicted by a dark blue shaded area. Now, to operate a drone anywhere within this dark blue shaded area, you're going to need that FAA airspace authorization that we've been talking about prior to flight. Depending on where you want to fly within this dark blue shaded area, you also may be limited to altitudes less than 400 feet above ground level. So, for example, here we're looking at Denver International Airport. You can use LAANC to request your authorization, meaning you can apply through Aloft or any of the other FAA's approved UAS service suppliers of LAANC, submit your request, and then receive your authorization in near real time if you're going to operate below the altitudes that are depicted. But again, the key takeaway here is use that app and be aware of that airspace. So this is a great example of Class Bravo airspace, busy airspace that you're going to need an FAA airspace authorization to operate in. So let's step down the ladder a bit. Let's talk about Class C as in Charlie airspace. So we'll flip the slides here. And when we talk about Class Charlie airspace, we're still talking about fairly busy airports. However, they're just not as massive as the Class Bravo. So think of this ladder that we're stepping down here. So Class Charlie airspace have an operating control tower, just like Class Bravo airports, and are serviced by radar approach control, much in the same way that Class Bravo airports are. However, they're just not quite as busy, so we give them a different designation, Class Charlie. From a drone pilot's perspective, the takeaway is probably going to be the same. This airspace is circular in shape, usually extends out to be about a 5-mile radius from the airport center. If you're looking at the screen here, you're seeing Raleigh-Durham International Airport. You can see that it's shaded, sort of a purple shaded circle. That indicates Class C as in Charlie airspace. And just like Bravo, if you're going to operate a drone anywhere within that purple shaded circle, you're going to need an FAA airspace authorization before you take off with your drone, and you may be limited to altitudes less than 400 feet above ground level. So that is Class Charlie. Now stepping down again, we're going to move to Class Delta. So these are Class D airports. Class D airspace usually is around airports that are less busy than Charlie and Bravo, if we keep with our theme here, but they still have an operating control tower. There's quite a few of these airports in the United States. The airspace is more often than not, almost always, dare I say, circular in shape and extends out maybe about 5-mile radius from the airport center. So on the screen here, you can see Houston's David Wayne Hook Memorial Airport. This is located in Class Delta airspace, and you can see that on the map because of that light blue shaded circle that's surrounding the airport. And as you probably guessed, just like all the other Class Bravo Charlie airports, if you're going to fly a drone anywhere in this light blue shaded area, you will need an FAA airspace authorization prior to flight, and you may be limited to altitudes less than 400 feet above ground level. So now that we covered Class Bravo, Class Charlie, Class Delta, let's get to the little strange one we call Class Echo 2. This tends to confuse more people than any others, but if we can just break it down and keep it real simple, I think it's easy to understand. So these airports we're talking about, Class Echo 2, are airports that do not have an operating control tower. And there's a lot of airports in the United States that do not have operating control towers. But what's unique about these airports is they're not in uncontrolled airspace. They're actually located within Class Echo airspace, which is controlled. So this airspace, this Class Echo airspace that goes right down to the surface by airports, we speak to in terms of this is surface Class Echo airspace designated for an airport. It's also known as Class Echo 2, excuse me, but the end result is really just the same as Class Bravo, Charlie, and Delta. That's the good news here. So if you're looking at the screen here, you can see Red Bluff Airport. It's located in Class Echo 2 airspace. You have a green shaded area surrounding it. Before you go flying in that airspace, you're going to need an FAA airspace authorization. And just like the other controlled airspaces I've talked about, you may be limited to less than 400 feet above ground level. Now, one thing you might notice right away that's slightly different about Echo 2 is the shape. So they're not always circular. In fact, a lot of times they're not circular. And this is because we have little extensions, as you can see, for example, on your screen here. That extension exists because it facilitates safe airspace arrivals for traditional aircraft landing during poor weather. So they kind of have these little rectangular extensions off it. And that's something to be aware of when you're looking at the Class Echo 2 airspaces, is that they're not always circular. But again, let's keep it really, really simple here. Class Bravo, Class Charlie, Class Delta, Class Echo 2, they're all depicted by different color shadings on the Before You Fly app, and they will all need FAA airspace authorizations prior to flight.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kevin, for going through each of those airspaces, especially E2, as you mentioned. We get a lot of questions, and I know you do as well. So it's great that we have that explanation. It makes so much sense as to, why the shapes are a bit different. And if there is any other questions that the audience has, feel free to add those into the chat or the Q&A box now. And now I will give a live demo on both desktop and mobile of Before You Fly. We'll kind of look at some of those different types of airspace that Kevin just referenced, and then we will switch over from the Before You Fly app to the Aloft application to show you how to apply for a LAANC authorization. You can use this similar process on any of your preferred UAS service suppliers apps. So here we have the Before You Fly app on iOS on my iPhone pulled up on the left, and we have Before You Fly's desktop platform pulled up on my browser here on the right. So you can see we have located KDEN, or Denver Class B Airport. And when we have KDEN pulled up here on the Before You Fly platform, you can see we can click the More button on both of the Airspace Advisory tabs. You can do that on desktop and on mobile here. And so you can see the UAS facility map has a permissible altitude for authorization of 100 feet at this specific location near KDEN. And there it says there's auto approval, and then you could use further coordination through the FAA's drone zone available up to 400 feet. And then if you click this yellow box, it'll give that information. Yes, you are in controlled airspace, and there would need to be a LAANC authorization that you would need to receive to operate in controlled Class B airspace. This is what Class B, or Class Bravo controlled airspace, looks like on the Before You Fly application on the map, you can see there's a dark blue circle surrounding KDEN. And then since we have a few interesting airspaces here in the Denver area, if we click over here into KCFO, you'll see this airport, or Colorado Air and Spaceport, has a light blue circle surrounding it, is shaded light blue. You can see it here on mobile and on desktop. And this indicates, as we learned from Kevin's demo, that this is Class D airspace. So it would also require a LAANC authorization, but you can see these different color variations give you information about what type of airspace you are operating in or near. Now, if we zoom out a little bit, we can find an example of Class C airspace, or Class Charlie airspace, here in the Colorado Springs area. And is indicated by a color purple sphere surrounding Colorado Springs Airport, KCOS. We can pull this up on mobile and on desktop. So here on mobile, you'll see there's that yellow cautionary airspace advisory block, same on desktop. And when you click more, you can get information that, yes, this is indeed Class C, Class Charlie airspace. It is KCOS airport, and it is in controlled airspace, so it does require a LAANC authorization. And then up here above it is this blue UAS facility map block. So depending on where you click in this Class C airspace will determine what the permissible altitude for authorization is. So the further out, you'll see here on desktop, we have 200 feet is permissible. The airspace that I clicked in on mobile has 100-foot auto approval available. And then there is options for further coordination up to 400 feet using the FAA's drone zone. And now to close out the last type of controlled airspace that we'd like to look at on the Before You Fly map is our Class E2 airspace that Kevin gave us some great information about how it pertains to drone operations. So here we are looking at KRBL in Red Bluff, California, which is Class E airspace, E2 airspace, and it is indicated, as we saw in the screenshot in our presentation, by a light green shading. And you'll see, as Kevin mentioned, we have this runway area that's square here at the bottom, and then a sphere of about a 5-mile radius that's surrounding the airport in Red Bluff. So if we drop down, we can look at more of the information in the Airspace Advisory tabs here. So we'll see all of the information that, yes, this is Class E2 airspace, it's controlled airspace, and you would need a LAANC authorization in order to operate in it. Coming up here under our UAS facility map, Airspace Advisory tab, you can click more and you'll see that the spot in which I am clicked in both on mobile and desktop has an auto approval available up to 400 feet for this Class E2 airspace. So since we're on our last controlled airspace, looking at type here on the map, let me walk you through how to get a LAANC authorization. So since we are in the controlled airspace in E2 that we would like to operate in, and we have that selected on the map, on desktop or mobile, you can click Get LAANC. I'm going to walk you through on mobile, iOS. You'll click Get LAANC, and what it'll automatically do is it will take you to the Aloft platform. There are other UAS service suppliers, and you're welcome to use their application, whichever is preferred. But today I will be demoing how to apply for a LAANC authorization on the Aloft platform. So once Aloft is opened up, we can type in Red Bluff. We'll come in here, and you can see Now we have that Class E2 airspace opened up in the Aloft application. And if we zoom in, we can see all of the different ceiling heights for auto approval that you can apply for LAANC for. So if you click out here, we'll be in that 400-foot grid. You can see they just get smaller and smaller as you get closer to the runway itself. And we'll pull up. And so here we can see again that we're in that auto approval available up to 400 feet. You can click Get Authorization. You can either select recreational or commercial. I will select Part 107 commercial for the purposes of this demo. And then you can take the slider bar here. You can slide it all the way up to 400 feet. Just to give an example, if we were in this 100-foot grid, oops, we'll go back. If we click into this 100-foot grid up here, and we come back and we do that same Get Authorization, Part 107, it's going to change down to 100 feet. So it automatically recognizes what the auto approval height is for the location that you've selected in this controlled airspace. We'll stay in this 100-foot grid, but you could click anywhere in here. And then we'll slide it up to 100 feet. You also could select 50, whatever the max altitude you need, you can select up to. And then we'll zoom in a little bit here. And this is a polygon that you can manipulate. So if you click on the arrow buttons in the corner, you'll feel a little vibration, and then you can draw out any shape in your polygon that you would like so that it can take up the entire airspace that you would need to operate in. So now this shape looks good, and we have our auto approval height set to what we need, and we can click next. And then here, this allows you to schedule out your LAANC authorizations. So you could schedule it for a different day. You can schedule it for a different time of day. Right now, we'll just select now. Also can select a duration. So if you're doing an operation that might take all day, you could select a longer duration, but we'll go with an hour for this demo. Click OK. Gives all the information, some notes on LAANC, information about night operations and using LAANC and civil twilight and anti-collision lights and different things like that. And then also some information about how many overlapping LAANC approvals that you can have. And once you've read that, you can click next. And then here we'll see it does a pre-check results, and it does let you know that you are eligible for auto approval at KBL, Class E2 airspace during the designated date and time that we've selected for the duration that we've also selected. Click next. Here it gives some of my information about the pilot. So I would be the pilot in command in this demonstration, read through all of our terms, and then we can agree and submit. And you'll receive a text message that comes through with your LAANC approval and the LAANC number, as well as, since you're logged into your Aloft account, we now can see that myself, operator Erica Cooley, has a LAANC authorization for the polygon that we selected in Class E2 airspace for the designated period of time that we selected up to a ceiling height of 100 feet AGL. So this process can be replicated for any of the different types of controlled airspace that we indicated in our presentation. And with that, that concludes the demo that I wanted to show on B4UFLY, as well as on the Aloft platform of how you can apply for a LAANC authorization to give you access to all the different types of controlled airspace that there is in the US. And now that we have concluded our live demo, we will open up for our live Q&A section of our webinar today with Kevin and I. Hi, just coming on. live Q&A. Awesome. Hope everyone enjoyed the presentation, and we had lots of activity in the chat and the Q&A box. Really appreciate that. So Kevin and I are on for our live Q&A. Our audience did submit some questions ahead of time. We really appreciate that so that we can make sure that all of your guys' great questions are answered. So I'm going to start with a question that was submitted by Donald Engler. And the question I'll pose over to you, Kevin, is how may I gain information in how to fly in no-fly zones? How may I obtain clearance?
Got it. Yeah, thanks, Erica. And I'm really happy to be here to help answer questions. This is something that I don't get to do as often as I'd like. So every time I get to come out and chat, even if it's virtually, I really enjoy it. So that's a really good question from Donald. So when we're talking about no-fly zones, I'm going to make a bit of an assumption here and assume that we are talking about FAA airspace, no-fly zones, if you will. We don't really use that term in the FAA, but I know that term is also used a lot of times with local, state, and city tribal ordinances and laws, and I'm not going to go there for those, but I will definitely talk about the FAA airspace piece. And so when we talk about no-fly zones, we're really talking about restricted airspace. And I know we have another, I think, webinar coming up, right, Eric, where we get into more about special use airspace, but for now, let's just box that in to easily call it restricted or prohibited airspace. These are typically what we think of as no-fly zones. If you're going to fly in a restricted airspace or prohibited airspace, you're going to need special permission to do so. It's not something that you're going to get through LAANC. It's going to take a bit more coordination to go through that because, in a sense, we could be talking about areas that are around the White House. And you can probably imagine the amount of work and paperwork you'll need to do to fly your drone around the White House. But generally speaking, you're going to need permission in addition to any sort of LAANC authorization you might need to do that. So yes, there's ways to do it. You can certainly do it. And you need to find out why that airspace restriction is in effect, who controls that airspace restriction, which generally you can find out through a notice to air missions. If it's a temporary flight restriction that goes up, there'll always be a controlling agency listed. But just keep in mind that airspace is restricted for a reason. And if you're going to operate in that airspace, you really need to have a legitimate reason to be there. And while that can be a variety of things, like maybe it's a natural disaster support or inspection, or perhaps media needs to get in there, we really want to try to limit that airspace. The reason we restrict airspace, especially temporarily, is because we need to ensure the safety of it. And that's something that we have to maintain throughout all this discussion. So how do you get clearance to fly in a no-fly zone? Do your homework, find out who the controlling agency is, understand what the restriction is for, and then open up a dialogue with that agency. And just remember, it's going to take a lot of work, and you should start that way ahead of time. So don't start it today to fly tomorrow.
Absolutely. Such a good piece of advice for all drone pilots, whether commercial or recreational, is the planning ahead element. The tool of the B4UFLY app really gives that ability to plan ahead. So that first question kind of leads into a second question that we received from Fred Brunton. And it's, what is the best way to obtain long-term waivers in LAANC grids?
Yes, the long-term airspace authorization waiver. We actually did this a number of years ago. We have since moved on. LAANC has played a big role in that, creating a lot more flexibility than our waiver process. And it's also far easier to get authorization through LAANC than it is to obtain a waiver from the FAA. So that being said, we no longer use the waiver process to create long-term, a lot of people call them wide area authorizations too. It just was not a very efficient process, and it was not very flexible for most operators. And that's because LAANC, with most operations today, LAANC can be done, just as Erica showed in that demo, in near real time. You can get your authorization. And by the way, you can also submit those authorizations up to 90 days in advance, so that you don't need to wait to the day of if you're going to fly, although respecting most drone missions, that happens quite often. But if you can plan a little bit ahead, get those LAANC requests in ahead of time. That will also help out a lot. If you do have some sort of project that's going to require a long-term type authorization, you can use Drone Zone. You can submit your request in Drone Zone, explain what's happening, provide the area. Ultimately, that will also provide you with a little bit more flexibility than the old waiver process. You can do that also 90 days in advance. In fact, if you're using Drone Zone, and many of you probably have, it is not nearly as quick as LAANC. And I'm sure that's not a shock to anyone here at this call, but make sure you submit that in advance. So there are ways to do that. We do that either through just automated requests through LAANC or submit your request through Drone Zone. Keeping in mind, you can submit those requests up to 90 days in advance and get approvals up to 90 days in advance through LAANC.
Yeah, and there has been so many exciting, changes and opportunities in LAANC, and one of those was last spring, the addition of night flying and using LAANC for night operations, which I know, so exciting for many pilots. So we had a question come in from Paul Johansson, and his question was, what's new with flying at night?
A lot. Eric, as you were pointing out, just in the last year, we completely changed the rule under Part 107 for flying at night. It used to be something you had to obtain a waiver for, and if you remember my previous answer, that wasn't nearly as speedy and efficient and quite frankly easy as some people wanted it to be, and it was very difficult for a lot of folks, and that was the number one request. So we had a lot of lessons learned through the waiver process, and through experience and data, we were able to make that modification to the rule. So as it stands now, under Part 107, you may fly at night without a waiver as long as you're adhering to what the regulation requires. And there's certain things like lighting requirements and invisibility and time of day and things like that. There's also a requirement in there that if you haven't taken either an initial or recurrent remote pilot exam in about the past year or so now, you would need to do that, because what we did is we added some night flying content to that recurrent remote pilot exam and also the initial. So make sure you kind of look at the rule before you just go out there and fly around at night. But the really neat thing that we've been able to do relatively recently is incorporate the night operations into LAANC like we did the daytime. So now pilots wanting to fly under Part 107 at night can use LAANC in the exact same manner that they use it during the daytime. And that has been something that I think the drone flying community has been looking for a long time and has been very well received, and we're happy to say it's working very well.
Absolutely, and I think it is such a great piece of advice to go through the recurrent testing process if you are looking to fly at night. For myself, I did that last summer. It was time for my recurrent, and the timing was really nice because there was some nighttime operations that I wanted to do, and really getting education on some of the things like night blindness and different visual optical illusions that can happen with night operations was so informative. So really kudos to the FAA for that great new tool for us drone pilots to use. Awesome. So then kind of moving back towards some more airspace specific questions from Robert Thickner. Much of the confusion regarding airspace for UAS operators centers around Class E airspace, E1, E2, etc., and Class D military DoD restrictions and access. This is something you definitely touched on, Kevin, but would there be anything else that you could add for those type of airspaces?
Sure. How much time do we have? I've done entire presentations, both externally and to FAA people on Class E airspace. Look, for a little bit of a background on this, I'm a traditional aircraft pilot as well as a remote pilot. So the Class E airspace that I learned about as a traditional pilot, believe it or not, was far less complex than what I've had to learn as a remote pilot. And then that might seem a little bit backwards, but it's because of the locality and the altitudes that drones operate. For example, I didn't know there were 8 different classes of Echo airspace. I thought E airspace was just E airspace. Well, it's not. So I get it. It can be very, very confusing. But like I was saying in the presentation, just really keep it simple. Check before you fly. Check any FAA approved UAS service supplier of LAANC to make sure that whatever airspace you're about to operate in does not require an FAA airspace authorization. I don't want to say you don't need to understand airspace, because it's very important that we all understand airspace, but we also need to understand that we have to keep it relatively simple and easy for everyone to understand. Otherwise, it just doesn't work. So I think in those terms, we think controlled versus uncontrolled. That's the simplest way to think of it. So without going into a 30-minute presentation, I kid you not, it's a 30-minute presentation on Class Echo airspace, I would say just boil it down to use before you fly, use an FAA-approved service supplier of LAANC to check that airspace. If it's Class Echo 2 or Delta or Charlie, it's just going to tell you, hey, you need an FAA airspace authorization. That's what you need to know. That's what you need to request. And if an airport like military areas or military airports are not covered in LAANC, then you'll need to go through our FAA Drone Zone website and make the request there, keeping in mind that's not a real-time processing center, so submit that one in advance. I would say is as far in advance as you can.
Absolutely, yeah. And the tools through the Drone Zone are great. I've had great experiences using them, but as you mentioned, not as real time in the moment to moment when you need those authorizations. That's where LAANC is your best option if you can use it. So we have a few more questions. One from Roger Sherwood. How can I get an authorization when the system is down?
We're going to go right back to the previous answer. I think this is a really good question because, as many of you know, the system has gone down before. So when that happens, when LAANC goes down for whatever reason it happens to be down for, we ask that you go through the FAA Drone Zone account. That's going to be the, believe it or not, the quickest way to get your approval. Now, you're probably saying, well, FAA drone guy, Kevin, you just told me that LAANC isn't that Drone Zone's not a very quick way to get approval. You have to do it in advance. Yes, you're absolutely correct. You're not going to get a real-time authorization through Drone Zone like you would through LAANC. However, I'm going to go back to a previous point that I made, which is don't wait until the last minute to submit your LAANC authorization. If you know the weather is going to be good tonight and you know you got to fly tonight and you know the area that you're going to fly in, make that request in the morning and just say, here's when I want to fly, and go through LAANC. That way, if for some reason LAANC does go down, you're not stuck. And that's a messaging that we've been trying to communicate more to the drone community, which is you do not need to wait to the day of. Sure, LAANC is great and it works wonderful almost all the time and it's real-time work and we all love it, but it's a system, it's a computer, and sometimes it can go down. If you can plan ahead, that saves a lot of trouble. Again, up to 90 days in advance, you can apply for those LAANC authorizations. But if it does go down, you will be stuck using our FAA Drone Zone account and potentially missing a window you'd like to fly in.
Absolutely, yeah. Giving good advice of just, being able to plan ahead as often as you can. So yeah, you can avoid those moment-to-moment potential technology problems. So we have another question from William Holloran. Is it possible to get authorization to fly up to 400 feet in a zero restricted airspace like Class B? If so, how and how much lead time is required? This probably kind of loops back to that same thread we've been talking about, but I'll pose it over to you.
It does. It really does, Erica. And William, this is another really good question, and it's sort of the same answer, but maybe slightly different flavor here. So the scenario you posed can be very challenging, and for good reason. If we want to fly up to 400 feet in an area that air traffic professionals have already looked at and said, look, all things being equal, we don't want drones flying here. It's too great of a risk. Now you're requesting to go up to the maximum altitude generally permitted by Part 107. So you can see that a request to fly in a zero grid for Class Bravo airports, which again are nation's busiest airports, up to the maximum altitude permitted by rule, it's a steep request. Now, it's not impossible, don't get me wrong. And air traffic and the FAA will be happy to work with you wherever able to make these requests successful. But with something like that, when you're stacking risk upon risk upon risk, then you're going to need to do a lot more homework before you make that request. So we call these requests, whether you want to fly, let's say 200 feet in a 100-foot UAS facility map ceiling, or just at all in a zero grid, we call those further coordination. Now, you can do those through LAANC, and you can also do those through the Drone Zone. But with the requests like this, where we're really talking about perhaps the most complicated type of airspace authorization request you could think of, you're going to want to give yourself a lot of lead time. Do not wait until the last minute. Start working this 90 days in advance. And I mean that in all sincerity. Start working this 90-day in advance, because it's going to end up needing a dialogue between you and the facility that controls that airspace. Again, not impossible, but something that is going to take some time to work through. And the longer lead time you have, the more that air traffic professionals can say to you, hey, look at this, these are our concerns, what can you do to mitigate this risk? How can you address our concerns? You give yourself a lot of time to work through that.
Absolutely, yeah, and it just highlights, the importance of planning ahead, which we've kind of addressed in the last couple of questions, but especially if you have a special request like a 0-foot grid, that planning ahead as much as possible would be for the best. We had a great question come in through the chat from Gregory Masson. Also, Shauna Ray Brown was interested in hearing the answer to it. So the question is, it seems you need an internet connection to use the app. Can we have an option to download an area for offline usage?
So I have a really good answer to it, but you might not like part of it. So there is no ability right now to sort of download an offline map and to do everything offline. And the reason that is because what LAANC does, excuse me, when you submit your airspace authorization request, it provides notification to that air traffic control facility that a drone is operating there. That is a very critical piece of information because, as you can imagine, our air traffic professionals are responsible for safely securing aircraft and separation of traffic in their designated airspace. And if there's an airplane, which a drone is, remember, operating in that airspace that they don't know about, that can be problematic. So I imagine you're standing far off into the countryside, you have terrible cell signal reception, and you want to go fly, but there's maybe a Class Echo 2 airport nearby that you need to get authorization. It's just not going to happen with an offline map because that signal won't get to air traffic. The message won't get there. They won't know you're operating. But the good news is, I'm going to flip this coin over. The good news is, like I said, you can request that in advance. If you know you're going to be out in the countryside and you know you're going to be operating somewhere where you're not getting the greatest cell phone reception, and so LAANC authorization requests might be difficult, request that ahead of time. Even if it's the day of, before you leave the area with good cell reception. Maybe if you're a passenger in the car, as you know that the bars are dropping on your phone, hit that submit button before that bar drops to 0 and you get no service. But you have that. Again, you can request those far in advance. That will help out.
Yeah, that's great advice. And definitely, there are a lot of areas that you end up flying in that are rural. So being able to plan ahead if you don't have internet or cell connection is a great step for drone pilots to take. So I will maybe give you, Kevin, a minute to look through the chat and just see if there's any final pressing questions that you'd like to address. I wanted to highlight there was a comment from Michael Davis, and then we also received a comment ahead of time from Al Malbray about airspace that has maybe restrictions that need to be submitted to the Before You Fly app. So I wanted to mention our Aloft Geo portal. This is a great tool for any authoritative agencies, anybody who maybe represents an authoritative agency who's listening. You can, for free, submit GeoJSON shape files to basically update in live time the Before You Fly map to add an example Michael Davis gave was maybe a sporting venue that has something going on, that there's a flight restriction, or maybe there's a parade in a local area. We just had 4th of July this month, so if there was a firework display where there was an airspace restriction, those could be great things to add for airspace awareness. So I'll add a link in the chat if anybody would like to watch last month's webinar. We went through the Aloft Geo portal process of signing up and getting approved. Just to reiterate, this isn't for individual pilots. This would be for a representative from, like a Parks and Recreation, things like that. But I will put that in the chat now so that you guys can have that link. We're just awesome. Okay, so looks like we have a few more questions. Great questions from everyone. So thanks, Kevin, for taking a look through those.
Yeah, they're good questions. I like the engagement.
Yeah, you guys are a great audience. Really appreciating this conversation. So one that came in from Shauna Ray Brown was, do you need a LAANC authorization if you want to fly over 400 feet AGL?
Another really good question. Like I was just saying there, I love the engagement here. You guys have excellent questions, and this is really fun for me to do. So the short answer would be maybe, but let me expand on that a little bit. So if you remember, LAANC exists to provide airspace authorizations in controlled airspace. So generally speaking, I'm going to back up here. Drones are limited to 400 feet above ground level. That's under Part 107. That's pretty much the rule that we're talking about. Now, there are exceptions, there always are, but if you're doing maybe a tower inspection and you're flying within a 400-foot radius of a tower, you can fly to the top of that tower on another 400 feet. Those structure type exceptions do exist. So now what happens if that tower you're inspecting is in controlled airspace and you do need to fly higher than 400 feet? Well, if it's in controlled airspace and we're talking Bravo, Charlie, Delta, or that Echo 2 airspace that we talked about, then you would need a LAANC authorization to operate there. Remember, that is your notification to air traffic control. Hey, I'm putting an airplane in your airspace, and I want you to be aware of this. Now, if you're going to go up to a higher altitude, you would need to indicate that. And remember, I talked about earlier that concept of further coordination. That's what you would be doing. You would say, hey, look, and I know the maximum grid altitude here is 400 feet, but there's a 2,000-foot tall antenna out in your airspace here that I need to get to the top of to do an inspection. And so that further coordination through LAANC or drone zone will open up that dialogue with that facility, and you can work together to come up with a plan that would allow you to make that flight. If you're talking about flying in an area that doesn't have a tower in it, not a control tower, but like a structure tower radio antenna, and you want to go above 400 feet, now we're talking about a little bit different thing because you're normally limited to 400 feet by Part 107. So if there's no structure you're inspecting, so to speak, and you want to go above 400 feet, now you're getting into waivers. Now you're going to need an altitude waiver to go above 400 feet. And again, if that airspace was within that Bravo, Charlie, Delta, or Echo 2, that controlled airspace, you'll also need a LAANC authorization. And I'll tell you this, if you need a waiver to do what you want to do and a LAANC authorization, get the waiver first. Because what air traffic will do is they will ask you, how are you doing this? And if you say, well, I'm going to go get a waiver, they'll say, then come back to me when you have your waiver, and then we can work on the approval. So if you do need to go higher than 400 feet, that's not inclusive of that sort of structure inspection under Part 107, get the waiver first, then get your authorization to fly in that airspace. Good question.
Yeah, awesome. And kind of sticking with our airspace questions, we have probably time for one final question from Gregory Masson. It says, what is the minimum altitude of fixed wing and helicopters when they are flying through uncontrolled airspace? What is the safety margin between our 400-foot maximum altitude and the minimum altitude of other aircrafts?
Yeah, another really good question, and this is something that again could probably take about a half hour to go through all the different nuances of minimum safe altitudes for fixed wing aircraft or rotorcraft, which are traditional airplanes and helicopters. Sorry, I'm using pilot lingo here, but what we're really getting at here is, generally speaking, the minimum safe altitudes are around 500 feet for most aircraft. And that is exactly why most drones are limited to 400 feet. You get that 100-foot sort of buffer, if you will, between most aircraft operations minimum altitudes and most drone operation maximum altitudes. So generally speaking, it's 500 feet. Now, before anybody starts writing hate mail to me, there are always exceptions to this. Those minimum safe altitudes are based on a lot of different things. You really need to get under Part 91 of our regulations to read through all the different nuances, but there are a lot of aircraft and there are a lot of helicopters that routinely operate below 500 feet. Think of agricultural operations or crop dusters, if you will. Those guys, gals, routinely operate below treetop levels, doing a lot of work out there. Helicopters routinely operate at lower altitudes because they can safely land just about anywhere. So yes, we like to think of there's this 100-foot buffer out there between their minimum altitudes for most aircraft, but in reality, a lot of aircraft operate at treetop level or below. And as a drone pilot, you always need to be aware of that. Always have your set of eyes on the drone or have a visual observer with you that's watching the drone, so that if something comes up over those trees, and it happens, it can come up fast and you don't always hear it, you have the opportunity to get away. So I think, Erica, you mentioned always good idea to have a plan for maybe putting in your airspace authorization request, always a good idea to have a plan of, okay, what if we see an aircraft? What am I going to do with my drone? Because they can be at your altitude.
Absolutely, yeah. Going kind of to the traditional aviation checklists and SOPs that actually recently were integrated into the interface of Before You Fly. So if you guys haven't checked that out, there is a checklist feature, and just some of the basic things like Kevin was saying of creating a safety plan of when A happens, we do B plan. Having these step-by-step checklists really help you take out the unpredictability sometimes that flying a drone can have. With that, I think we'll wrap up our session today. I thank you so much, Kevin, for being on and sharing all of your great wisdom with us of things to do with airspace. We're so excited. We'll have Kevin back on next month to talk about cautionary airspaces, so things like MOAs, really getting into some of these maybe a little more confusing airspaces for some people. So we're very excited to have Kevin on, and that will be next month, August 17th, and there'll be an email that will come out inviting you guys to attend that. But with that, is there any closing remarks you'd like to leave our audience with today, Kevin?
I think just thanks for having me on. And what really gets me excited here is that the questions we received today, the comments in the chat, show that this audience is very engaged in what they're doing out there, and they want to do it the right way. They're asking the right questions, which is fantastic. You rewind the drone industry about 5 years and go back, we didn't get these same types of questions. The questions were, if you will, a lot more concerning. But now it seems like there's a great knowledge level out there, a great knowledge base, a lot of fantastic drone communities, a lot of drone pilots wanting to do things the right way. And that is just great to hear from a safety standpoint, because I share the airspace with you, you share it with my parents, you share it with everybody that's flying. So just remember that you're part of the system now. You're a pilot, you're flying an aircraft, and make sure that when you go up, you're flying right and you're always doing the right thing. So thank you for your time, everyone. It's a very pleasure to virtually meet you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much to the Aloft community for joining us today, and we hope to see you on next month's webinar. Hope you guys all have a great rest of your day. Bye.